Over 60% of SAT students do worse on the English portion. So, if you want to improve your English score, then I recommend you watch this punctuation guide till the end. You won't miss another question after this, I promise. Alright, so with commas, there are four main rules, and the first rule is fanboys plus a comma. So this is when you're joining two full sentences, also known as independent clauses. So we see here, I studied hard, comma, but I still felt nervous. You use a comma. But since it's not two sentences on the second example, I studied hard but felt nervous, because felt nervous is not a complete sentence, there would be no comma there. Alright, so the second rule is probably the most common, and many of you guys know this. It's just to separate items in a list of three or more. So I brought pencils, snacks, and my calculator. Just remember that if there are commas inside of the list, like if there's an item in the list that needs a comma, for example, a location like Albany, New York, that would have a comma, right? Then you would use semicolons to separate those because it's a complex list. The third rule is introductory elements, and you use a comma after an introductory word or phrase, which is a dependent clause. So we see, after the exam, I went to sleep. I went to sleep is an independent clause. After the exam is a dependent clause. It's not a complete sentence. It won't stand alone. And the second one is also the same. And this one is by far one of the most important rules ever when it comes to commas on your SAT test. So, put commas around non-essential information, also known as stuff that you can remove. The professor, a 50-year-old man, looked tired. You can remove the explanation that he's a 50-year-old man. It would be the professor looked tired. And it sounds like a normal sentence. This second example right here, it sounds correct, but it's incorrect. And the reason is that Sarah is essential information in the sentence. So my friend Sarah is also coming. Well, since there's multiple friends, whoever you're saying this to, my friend Sarah is also coming, whoever you're saying this to, they don't know which friend you're talking about, right? Because it says also. So that means there's multiple friends. So you wouldn't know which friend you're talking about, which is why you cannot put commas here. You would say, my friend Sarah is also coming. Alright, let's test your knowledge with the quick practice question. So, I'm going to let you read it, pause the video, see if you can figure it out. I'll see you soon. Okay, I assume you paused the video. The answer is C, and I'll explain it right now. While one requires oxygen and we know the words, so while one requires oxygen and one does not, aerobic and anaerobic respiration are both forms of cellular respiration. That is, there are processes by which cells break down glucose to use as energy. So we know that there is a dependent clause, right? While one requires oxygen and one does not, that cannot stand alone as its own sentence. So that is a dependent clause. So we know that the answer cannot be B, right? Because there can't be a period here. Semicolons, you might learn this in another video, but semicolons are used to separate independent clauses. And they can also be used in place of periods. Since we see two technically right answers that can both separate independent clauses, we know that these are both not the answer. So B and D are already eliminated. Answer A is incorrect because, okay, so first you can just read it and it won't sound right because it makes a run-on sentence. But it's a dependent clause and it comes before an independent clause. So if an independent clause comes before a dependent clause, which is the opposite of what we have here, it would work without a comma. We can say, I stayed inside because it was raining. Because it was raining is a dependent clause. But you can't say, because it was raining, I stayed inside. You would have to say, because it was raining, comma, I stayed inside. So since we have a dependent clause here, we would need a comma to connect with the independent clause. But theoretically, if the independent clause came before the dependent clause, we could, without a comma, connect the two. So yeah, that's how you know that C is the right answer. And when it comes to semicolons on the SAT, there are two main rules. So the first rule is when you want to connect two independent clauses. Both sides of the sentence must be complete sentences because that's what an independent clause is. And a good trick to remember is that a semicolon can replace a period. It basically is a period because we can see I finished homework, I finished the homework, period, I went to bed, that would also be grammatically correct. But since they both relate, because you finished the homework and then you went to bed, we can use a semicolon to connect them into one sentence and join the two independent clauses. Because I was tired, semicolon, I went to bed. This is incorrect. And the reason that this is incorrect is because I was tired is not a complete sentence. It is a dependent clause, not an independent clause. And yeah, so basically just remember that when you use semicolons, you can use it to connect two independent clauses. All right, let's move on to the next rule. So the second rule is you use semicolons in complex lists. So you would use semicolons to separate list items that are already containing commas. For example, I visited Albany, New York, Austin, Texas, and Salem, Oregon. So the reason we use semicolons here is because if we use commas, it would look as if Albany was its own thing, and New York was its own thing, and Austin was its own thing, and Texas was its own item in the list. Since we use semicolons, we know that Albany, New York itself is one item. And since it already includes commas, it would be less confusing if there was a semicolon versus if there were commas. So just remember, do not do this where it says Albany, New York, Austin, Texas, because it acts as if Albany is its own place and then New York is its own place, which technically it is, but we're using Albany, New York to represent the city of Albany in New York. All right. So yeah, those are basically the two main rules. And without further ado, let's jump right into the practice question for today. So I encourage you to read the question and pause the video if you want to get a better look at it. And yeah. Okay, so I assume that you've paused the video and read it and answered it. And let's go over it together. The Mission 66 initiative, which was approved by Congress in 1956, represented a major investment in the infrastructure of overburdened national blank. It prioritized physical improvements to the park's roads, utilities, employee housing, and visitor facilities, while also establishing educational programming for the public. Which choice completes the text so that it conforms to the conventions of standard English? Okay, so we know infrastructure of overburdened national, and we know the next word is parks, because all of these include parks. So right off the bat, we know that, the Mission 66 initiative, which was approved by Congress in 1956, represented a major investment in the infrastructure of overburdened national parks. That is a full sentence. And then we have another full sentence here. It prioritized physical improvements to the park's railroads, roads, utilities, employee housing, etc., etc. And we know that they're two independent clauses. So technically, in this situation, it would be fair to connect the two sentences with a period. But there's no period here. There's no period in the answer choices seen here. There's only a semicolon. And we remember that one of the rules states that a semicolon is equivalent to a period in most cases. So we can actually just say parks, semicolon, and then it prioritizes that. And that would complete the sentence so that it conforms to the conventions of standard English. Alright, so once again with colons, just like with semicolons, there are two main rules. The first rule is adding explanation or extra information. So a colon must come after a full sentence, and it can be used to introduce more detail or an explanation. For example, she had one dream, to attend Harvard. The part after the colon here explains the dream, so it's additional information. An incorrect example would be such as, to attend Harvard, because there's no full sentence before the colon, so it's unclear what's going on. The next rule when it comes to colons is introducing a list. So here we see bring the essentials, pencils, calculator, and ID. An incorrect example of this would be I have pencils, calculator, and ID. And even though this would sound right, there's two problems to this. Number one, it's not a complete sentence. And number two, it already introduces the list. So if you don't have a colon there, you can just say, I have pencils, calculator, and ID. And that would be completely fine. So there's no use of adding a colon. All right, there's one important warning that you need to remember. Colons are only used after independent clauses. So a colon has to come after a complete sentence. And on any SAT question, if there's no complete sentence and the answer choice has a colon, you can eliminate that right away because it's impossible for a colon to come after a dependent clause or an incomplete sentence. So correct example would be she made one thing clear. She would never give up. But this would not be correct. Because she was tired, she went to bed early. Although it includes additional information, it's not a complete sentence, which is why it's incorrect. So make sure you remember that. Alright, let's try a practice question now. As always, I'll let you guys try it, pause the video, and yeah. So I assume you tried out the practice question, and now I'm going to go over it. So in a 2016 study, Eastern Washington University psychologist Amani El-Alyali found that, among other study participants who experienced frisson, a psychological response akin to goosebumps or getting the chills while listening to music, there was one personality trait that they scored particularly blank, openness to experience. So we can tell here that the words that we need to say are high on. And we also know that openness to experience is additional information. Okay? So since we know that a colon could be one of the answers. But let's go over why everything else cannot be an answer. A cannot be an answer because if we say there was one personality trait that they scored particularly high and then on openness to experience would be a dependent clause. So that's impossible. Answer choice B would be incorrect because according to semicolon rules, a semicolon only connects two independent clauses, and these two are not independent clauses since openness to experience is a dependent clause. Answer choice C would also be incorrect because that would create a run-on sentence since the entire thing is one sentence. So while listening to music, there was one personality trait that they scored particularly high on openness to experience. That already doesn't sound right. And you're right that it doesn't sound right because it's not right. But answer choice D has a pause and it follows an independent clause as well. So this whole thing is a complete sentence and then we have our colon, which is why we know that it has to be a colon because there's a complete sentence. So we know that a colon is grammatically correct in this situation. And we see the additional information, which is why it has to be answer choice D. There's only one rule for the dash, and it actually comes up more often than what you would think. Basically, all a dash does is it sets off non-essential information. For example, the SAT, like any standardized test, rewards strategy. And you may be thinking, commas also do this. And you're right. Commas do the same thing as dashes, except dashes add more emphasis. And that's what makes dashes different. And you can also do it at the end of a sentence. So like, he aced the SAT, a result he never thought possible. Right? For this one, you wouldn't have a comma, you would have a semicolon since it's two independent clauses. But you get the point. It's emphasis and it's non-essential information. This information is not essential. So we don't need it. And we can say he aced the SAT. And that's a complete sentence. For example, also for this one, we can also say the SAT reward strategy. Alright, so without any further ado, let's go straight into a practice question so you can test your knowledge. Alright, so I assume you paused the video and gave it a try on your own, and now I will go over the answer. Lucy Tapahonso is the inaugural poet laureate of the Navajo Nation. Her book, The Women Are Singing, a combination of fiction and memoir, poetry and blank, serves as a testament to her versatility as a writer. So after reading the sentence, we can see that there's already a dash over here. And that leads us to believe that since there's an opening dash, there has to be non-essential information somewhere. So let's try to find the non-essential information. The non-essential information could likely be a combination of fiction and memoir, poetry, and prose. And that is because we know that her book, The Women Are Singing, serves as a testament to her versatility as a writer, stands alone as a complete sentence. I just read it to you, and it sounds like a complete sentence, and it is a complete sentence because it's an independent clause. Since we know that that is a complete sentence, we have to know that whatever comes in between has to be non-essential information. And since we know that it's non-essential information and there is an opening dash, the correct answer has to be answer choice D, which says prose with a dash.